The Man Who Never Smiled. The bell above the cafe door chimed with a metallic ring as Eleanor wiped the counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning. She knew what was coming: the heavy thud of boots against the wooden floor, the measured yet impatient breath of a man who had made it a habit to order the same coffee, sit in the same chair, and scowl at the world as though it had personally wronged him. And there he was, just as always, Daniel Graves, a man whose very name seemed to carry the weight of sorrow. His dark coat billowed slightly as he stepped inside, rain droplets trailing from his shoulders like forgotten tears. His sharp gaze swept across the room, his features carved into a permanent grimace, as if he were searching for a reason to be angry. Eleanor had worked here long enough to know his order before he spoke. A black coffee, no sugar, no pleasantries. Just silence and simmering discontent. She handed him the cup, and he took it without a word. But that day, something changed. As he reached for his wallet, Eleanor, on a whim, stopped him. "It's on the house today," she said with a warm smile. A rare kindness. A fragile attempt to break whatever invisible chain bound him so tightly to his own misery. Daniel froze, his eyes narrowing. Suspicion flickered in his gaze, but instead of snapping at her, he did something she never expected. He nodded, just a single, reluctant nod, as though he was unsure how to react to such a simple act of generosity. Then, something even more unexpected happened, a flicker of a smile, barely there, as if it had been trapped behind a locked door for years and was finally peeking through a crack. Days passed and something shifted. He began to linger a little longer. His presence, once a storm cloud over the cafe, softened. He still barely spoke, but his scowl lost its sharp edges. It wasn't until the third week that Eleanor noticed something else, something chilling. The air around him seemed heavier, denser, as if shadows clung to his frame just a little too long before retreating. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But then the lights above flickered whenever he walked in. The air would turn colder in his wake, and on more than one occasion, she could have sworn she heard whispers, low and distant, like voices carried by the wind. Curiosity gnawed at her, a relentless hunger. Who was he? What burden did he carry? One evening, as the cafe emptied, she found the courage to ask. "Daniel," she began carefully, watching for any sign of resistance, "why do you always look like the world has let you down?" He looked up from his untouched coffee, his eyes shadowed by something old and painful. "Because it has," he said simply. And then, after a long pause, he added, "I lost someone." The admission came with an exhale, as though releasing it allowed him to breathe for the first time in years. "My wife. 10 years ago. And I never smiled again." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy quilt. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. But there was something else, something more beneath his grief. "Do you still see her?" she asked hesitantly. His fingers tightened around the cup. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Yes. Every night. She stands at the foot of my bed. She never speaks. Just watches. Waiting." A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. There was no laughter in his tone, no hint of delusion, just raw, unwavering certainty. And suddenly she understood. The cold that followed him, the flickering lights, the whispers. He wasn't just haunted by her memory, he was haunted by her presence. That night, unable to shake the unease coiling in her stomach, Eleanor did something she never thought she would. She followed him home. His house stood at the edge of town, an old Victorian relic swallowed by overgrown vines and shadows too thick for the night to claim. The moment he stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, watching from a safe distance. And then she saw it, a figure, pale and motionless, standing just beyond the window. A woman with hollow eyes and lips that never moved. But the worst part? She was smiling. a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, as though mocking the man who had refused to do the same for a decade. Eleanor gasped and the figure turned. Their eyes met. A chill wrapped around her throat, squeezing. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred. And then nothing. She awoke in her own bed, drenched in sweat. Had it been a dream? A nightmare birthed by Daniel's tragic story? Or something else? The next day, he didn't come to the cafe, nor the next. On the third day, she went to his house, dread coiling in her stomach like a living thing. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was stale, thick with something she couldn't name. And there, in the dim glow of the dying evening light, she found him, sitting in his chair, eyes open, a cup of untouched coffee in his hand. He was smiling. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't move. She simply stared at the impossible. A man who had not smiled in 10 years, now frozen in death with a peaceful expression. And on the wall behind him, written in something dark and smudged, were the words, "Thank you." The cafe never felt the same after that. Eleanor continued working, but she never quite stopped feeling watched. Sometimes, on rainy evenings, the door chime would ring with no one there. And sometimes, just sometimes, she swore she could hear a whisper in the wind, a voice, soft and distant, saying, "Keep smiling."
Whispering echoes.